The knife was already at Rafael Veyr's throat before Yelena Carmichael understood what she was witnessing. She had been carrying a tray of whiskey glasses across the marble floor of the obsidian lounge when the man in the grey suit moved. She registered the motion before her brain processed the danger. A flicker of silver, a blur of expensive fabric, and then Lord Casimir Wrath had the king of the Northern Vampire Court pinned against the bar, with a blade forged from something that hummed with a dark, unnatural resonance. Not silver, something worse. Something that made the air around it taste like copper and old ash. Rafael did not flinch. That was the terrifying part. His pale hands rested loosely at his sides, his white hair swept back from a face carved like a cathedral statue. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the color of storm-dark wine. He looked at Casimir with the particular kind of calm that belonged only to creatures who had survived centuries of people trying to kill them. "You brought a hollow-forged blade into my establishment," Rafael said, his voice so low it should not have been audible across the room. Yelena heard every syllable. "That is a violation of blood law, Casimir. The court will not forgive it." "The court," Casimir said softly, his lips curving, "is about to be mine." The room had gone rigid. 12 vampires occupied the lounge tonight, members of the inner court, advisors, 2 foreign dignitaries from the eastern reaches. They wore their wealth like armor and their contempt like cologne. Every one of them had looked through Yelena all evening, the way people look through furniture. She was the human waitress. The hired warmth that made the lounge feel less like a mausoleum. She was utterly invisible. That invisibility had let her see things no one meant for her to see. She had seen Casimir slip the blade from his jacket lining 40 minutes ago. She had seen him pass a folded note beneath the table to Lady Seraphine Drew, whose answering smile had been the most dangerous expression Yelena had ever witnessed on a human-shaped face. She had heard the whispered word "tonight" twice, and "the king does not leave this room" once. She had done the math. The tray hit the floor with a sound like shattering winter. Every head in the room turned toward her. Yelena was already moving, not away from the danger, but toward it. Snatching the small bottle of accelerant from beneath the service bar that the staff used for tableside cocktail flames, lighting the long match in the same motion, and pressing the burning tip against the edge of the ornate velvet curtain that Casimir stood exactly beside fire-loved old fabric. The curtain went up in a roar of orange and gold. The lounge exploded into chaos. Casimir reeled back from the sudden heat, which was the specific weakness of hollow-forged blades. They required absolute stillness of focus to maintain contact, and fire was the one thing that broke that focus. Yelena had learned that in the 3 months she had spent quietly, carefully reading every text she could find in the employee archive room that was definitely not supposed to be accessible to human staff. Rafael moved the instant the blade lost contact with his skin. He was simply somewhere else, beside her, materializing from displaced air, his hand closing around her wrist with a grip that was firm without being brutal, pulling her back from the spreading flames while his other hand extended toward the room, and his voice dropped into something that was not quite sound anymore, something that rolled through the walls and the floor and the bones of every creature present. Enough. It was not a shout. It did not need to be. Casimir stumbled against the wall, the blade clattering from his fingers as a wave of invisible force pressed outward from Rafael like a tide. Lady Seraphine Drew made a sound like a broken instrument. The other conspirators, Yelena counted 4 of them instinctively. Because she had been counting all night, went to their knees, the sprinkler system activated. Cold water rained down in silver curtains, killing the fire, soaking Yelena to the bone and turning Raphael's white hair into something that dripped like cathedral stonework in rain. He still had not released her wrist. He looked down at her. His eyes, up close, were extraordinary, deep wine red, threaded with something that looked almost like amber when the emergency lights caught them. "You set my curtain on fire," he said. "You were about to die," she said. His expression did something complicated. "I was not going to die." The hollow forged blade had been in contact for 6 seconds, she said. The paralytic component in hollow forging works on vampire motor function after 8 seconds of sustained contact. You had 2 seconds left before you could not have moved at all. I read about it in the archive. A very long pause. "That archive is classified," he said. "The lock was broken," she said. I reported it 3 times. No one fixed it. Something moved across his face that might, in a different context, have been the beginning of a smile. Then the court security descended, and the room became very loud and very complicated. And Yelena stood dripping in the center of it all, still holding the empty bottle of cocktail accelerant, and told herself very firmly that the warmth in her chest was simply the adrenaline leaving her system and absolutely nothing else. She had been wrong about that before. Her name was Yelena Carmichael. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a woman who had believed in reading everything and fearing nothing, and she had been working at the Obsidian Lounge for 8 months because it paid enough to cover her graduate school tuition and her mother's medical bills and her small apartment in the part of the city where humans who knew about vampires tended to cluster. Finding safety in the knowledge itself, she had not expected to save the Vampire King's life on a Tuesday. She had certainly not expected him to remember her name. Rafael Veyr called for her 3 days later. Not through the lounge manager, not through the building's administrative system. He sent a court liaison, a pale, beautifully turned out vampire named Isolde, who appeared at Yelena's apartment door at 7 in the morning, with an envelope sealed in black wax and the expression of someone delivering a royal summons, which was, in fact, exactly what she was doing. The envelope contained a single card. The handwriting was old-fashioned and precise. Miss Carmichael, I would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. The matter concerns your safety and an offer of significant consequence. Please understand that this is a request and not a command. Yelena read it twice, then she made coffee. Dressed carefully in the most composed-looking outfit she owned, and went. The building that housed the public face of the Northern Vampire Court was a converted Victorian mansion on the quieter side of the city's financial district. Its upper floors looked ordinary enough: law offices, an investment firm, a private members' club that appeared in no directory. But the lower levels descended beneath the street into something that had been carved from the bedrock long before the city existed above it. A layered world of stone corridors and vaulted rooms hung with tapestries that depicted histories no human historian had access to. Isolde led her down through 3 security checkpoints, each staffed by vampires whose expressions communicated with crystalline clarity that they found her presence both baffling and mildly offensive. Yelena maintained eye contact at each one and said nothing. She had found, over her 8 months working at the lounge, that maintaining eye contact and saying nothing was frequently more effective than any possible spoken response. The room she was brought to was not a throne room, though she suspected one existed somewhere in the lower levels. It was a study, book-lined walls, a fireplace that burned without visible fuel, a long mahogany desk, and 2 chairs arranged near the fire as though for a conversation between equals. Raphael stood at the window, which looked into a lit interior courtyard rather than at the street above. He was taller than she had registered in the chaos of the lounge. He wore dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, which was somehow more unsettling than formal court dress would have been, because it made him look almost approachable. His white hair was down around his jaw. His skin was the particular luminous pale of old marble in firelight. He turned when she entered. He looked at her with those wine-dark eyes for a moment before speaking. Miss Carmichael, thank you for coming. Please sit. She sat. He sat across from her. Isolde withdrew. Lord Casimir and Lady Seraphine are in court custody, he said, without preamble, as are 3 other members of what turns out to have been a fairly extensive conspiracy. This is largely thanks to the fact that you were paying attention when everyone else in that room, myself included, which I find professionally embarrassing, was not. I had an advantage, she said. They weren't watching me. No, he said, they never watched the staff. He turned a pen over in his fingers, a human habit, she realized, that he had probably carried for so long it was simply part of how he thought. Which raises a question I find myself unable to dismiss. Why were you watching them? Because I knew something felt wrong, she said. I've been working at the lounge for 8 months. I know what normal looks like. Casimir's body language changed when he sat down. He stopped performing relaxation and started performing calm, which is different. And Lady Seraphine kept touching the inside of her left wrist, which people do when they're waiting for a specific moment. Raphael, looked at her as though she had said something in a language he had not expected her to speak. "You studied them," he said. "I study everyone," she said. "I was finishing a graduate degree in behavioral psychology before I took the job. I needed the income. The lounge pays well." "It does," he said. He set the pen down. "Miss Carmichael, I would like to make you an offer. The court needs a human liaison, someone who can move between the human world and this one, without triggering the social performance that happens when vampires interact with other vampires, and without carrying the power-related blind spots that our own people carry. You have already demonstrated that you are observant, calm under extraordinary pressure, and apparently capable of arming yourself with a cocktail torch and classified law in under 30 seconds. The law was already in my head," she said. "The torch was improvisation." He almost smiled. "The position comes with considerable compensation, full court protection, and I want to be transparent about this. A degree of personal danger that is significantly higher than carrying whiskey glasses across a marble floor. The people Casimir was working with extend beyond this court. There is a faction that calls itself the Pale Consensus. They believe the Northern Court has grown too interested in coexistence with the human world. They consider it a corruption of blood law, and they will try again," she said. "Yes, and you think having a human liaison will help you understand how they're operating in the human world, where you can't easily go during the day." "Precisely." Yelena thought about her mother's hospital bills, which were not going to stop arriving. She thought about her graduate thesis on group behavioral dynamics under social stress, which was sitting unfinished on her laptop. She thought about the way Casimir's blade had hummed against the air and the way Rafael had looked at her when she told him about the paralytic component. Not with the condescending surprise she had expected, but with something that looked almost like recognition. "I have conditions," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I want access to the full archive. Not the broken lock version, the real one. If I'm going to understand what I'm dealing with, I need actual information." "Agreed. I want the protection extended to my mother, who is currently in a care facility on the east side and who is completely uninvolved in any of this." Something shifted in his face. "Agreed. And I should have offered that without being asked. My oversight, forgive it. And I want to be treated as a professional in all court interactions, not as a human curiosity, or a blood law exception, or a charity case. If someone in this building speaks to me the way the door guard on level 2 just did, I expect you to address it." A very brief silence. Then Raphael said, "What did the guard say?" He asked Isolde while I was standing directly in front of him, whether I'd been checked for weapons. Then he answered his own question by saying that humans rarely had the nerve for it. Raphael's expression went very still in a way that Yelena was already learning to read as the vampire equivalent of controlled fury. "I will address it," he said, with the kind of quiet certainty that suggested the guard would find his next several professional interactions uncomfortably memorable. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Carmichael?" "We do," she said. "And you can call me Yelena." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not yet translate. "Rafael," he said. The next 4 weeks were the most intellectually alive Yelena had felt in years. She arrived at the court building each morning before most of the vampire staff reached productive alertness. They were not technically weakened by daylight in the lower levels, but their circadian rhythms still pulled toward night, and the hours between 9 and noon were quiet in ways that let her work without interruption. She read. She built a behavioral map of the court's social structure, cross-referencing the political histories in the archive with the daily interaction patterns she observed. She learned the names and old-world affiliations of every significant figure in the Northern Court's orbit and began tracking the Pale Consensus through the fragments of correspondence and the court's intelligence files. Raphael worked nights primarily, but adjusted his schedule with a fluidity that suggested he had learned long ago how to move through time without being owned by it. He would appear in the archive room at unexpected hours, and they would talk about the Pale Consensus, about court politics, about the historical conflicts that had shaped the blood laws, about human behavioral research, and how it applied to beings who had been performing social roles for centuries. He listened to her with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had learned that time was not something to race against. She learned things about him in those hours. that he had been made king not by desire but by necessity. Following the collapse of the previous court structure in an event the archives referred to, obliquely, as the Night of Fracture, something had broken in the court's leadership 40 years ago, a betrayal of such complete and devastating scope that the entire structure of vampire governance in the north had to be rebuilt from nothing, and Rafael had been the one left standing, who was both old enough to command respect and principled enough to be trusted. He had not wanted the crown. He wore it with the particular gravity of someone who carried a responsibility they had not chosen. That he was, beneath the regal stillness and the terrifying authority, genuinely funny in a way that caught her off guard every time. He had an extremely dry humor that he deployed at moments when she least expected it, and the first time she laughed, really laughed, not a polite acknowledgement, at something he said. He looked at her with a brief, unguarded expression that she filed away very carefully, that he was protective in ways that were reflexive rather than calculated. She learned this when a visiting lord from the western reaches named Aldrich Morvain made a comment during a formal reception about the wisdom of keeping soft human assets so close to sensitive intelligence. Yelena had been in the adjacent room, reviewing notes, and she heard Raphael's response through the wall. It was 14 words, spoken in a tone so quiet and so final that there was a long silence afterward before Morvain attempted a reply. She could not hear the exact words, but Morvain spent the rest of the reception standing as far from Yelena as the room's dimensions allowed, which she found privately satisfying. She learned that he checked on her mother's care facility. Not conspicuously. She would not have known except that she called the facility one evening, and the administrator mentioned, almost in passing, that they had received an anonymous donation that covered the outstanding balance and 6 months forward, and that a security consultant had reviewed their visitor access protocols and made several improvements. Yelena sat with her phone in her hand for a long time after that call ended. The danger came back on a Friday evening, 6 weeks into her role, in the form of an invitation. It arrived through official channels, a request from a consortium of court-recognized vampire families for an emergency diplomatic gathering at the estate of a Lord Vos Caldrent in the hills north of the city. The stated purpose was mediation of a territorial dispute. The attending list included several key members of the Northern Court, and the invitation extended, pointedly, to the King's human liaison, whose perspective on cross-community affairs will be valued by all parties. Yelena brought it to Rafael immediately. He read it with no expression at all, which she had learned was worse than visible displeasure. "Caldrent," he said. "He has maintained public neutrality, but his family's old-world ties run closer to consensus thinking than he admits. This gathering is either genuinely about territorial mediation, or it is a second attempt." He set the letter down. "I will not take you into that estate." "You may not have a choice," she said. "If you refuse the invitation entirely, it signals that the court is afraid of open dialogue, which feeds exactly the narrative the consensus wants to build. But if you attend without your liaison after specifically introducing the role in public court communication, it signals that the role is not what you claimed." He looked at her. "You are not wrong. I know." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'll go. But I want to know everything you know about Caldrent, his estate, the other attending families, and the specific nature of the blood laws that govern neutral ground gatherings. I want every piece of information the archive has, and I want a way to communicate with you that does not rely on devices that can be blocked." He was quiet for a moment. "There is an old-world method," he said slowly. "A blood link, not a blood bond. I want to be very clear on the distinction, because a bond carries obligations that neither of us has agreed to, and that I would never impose on you without full understanding and consent. A link is simpler. It allows proximity sensing. You would know where I am, and I would know where you are, and if either of us experiences significant physical distress, the other registers it immediately. How is it established? A drop of my blood on your wrist and a spoken acknowledgement. It lasts approximately 30 days and fades unless renewed. It requires your willing agreement. It cannot be used to compel you or influence your thoughts in any way." She considered this. "The archive has 3 different accounts of blood links being used to track humans against their will. In those cases, the blood was administered without the human's knowledge," he said. The willing acknowledgement is not ceremonial. It is functionally protective. The link only forms when both parties are aware and consenting. It is one of the oldest blood laws and one of the few that has never been contested. Show me the source text. He pulled it from the archive, without hesitation, which was itself informative. She read it. He was telling the truth. All right, she said. Yes. He came around the desk and stood before her, and she noticed again how tall he was, how absolutely still he could be, when he was not consciously affecting motion. He extended his hand, and she gave him her wrist. The cut was so swift and fine she barely felt it. The thread of his blood was cool against her skin, and he pressed his wrist against hers for 3 heartbeats and spoke something in a language older than anything she had encountered in the archive. 6 words that she felt in her sternum like a tuning fork struck against stone. Then it was done. She was aware of him as a kind of directional warmth at the edge of her peripheral senses, a compass with a single fixed point. "You'll be at the gathering?" she asked. "I'll be close. Close enough to be inside the estate grounds in under 60 seconds from the moment you need me, and if I don't need you, then we will have attended a deeply tedious diplomatic gathering, and nothing else," he said. She smiled. He watched the smile for a moment, with that unguarded expression she was storing up very carefully in a place she was not yet ready to examine. Caldrant's estate occupied the hills like something that had grown there rather than been built. 300 years of stone and ivy and deliberately cultivated menace. Lit by lanterns on the night of the gathering, because the family found electric light aesthetically presumptuous. Yelena arrived in a court vehicle with 2 vampire security personnel, who flanked her with the focused attention of people who'd been given very specific and very serious instructions. The gathering was initially exactly what it appeared to be. 12 families, their representatives, arranged around a great table in the estate's lower hall, discussing a territorial boundary dispute in the language of old-world courtesy that was simultaneously extremely formal and laced with implications that required significant background knowledge to fully decode. Yelena sat in the observer's position, took careful notes, and watched the room. Lady Isidore Veyr was the one who gave it away. She was seated at the far end of the table, representing a family whose interests had not seemed directly relevant to the territorial dispute. She said very little, but she kept looking at the door to the right of the main hall, the same door, at intervals that were just irregular enough to feel uncalculated, with an expression that was just controlled enough to feel deliberate. Someone was coming through that door at a specific time, and Isidore was timing herself against it. Yelena pressed her left hand flat against the inside of her right wrist. She had no way to make the blood link work directionally. It was not a communication device. But she held very still and thought, with great intention, about the quality of immediate urgency, because she had absolutely no basis for knowing whether that would do anything at all. It did something. She felt the compass warmth of him shift, move, grow closer with a speed that should not have been possible, and was entirely characteristic of what she had learned about him. She rose from the observer's chair. "If I may," she said, addressing the room with the calm that her mother had always described as her great inherited gift. "I need to step out briefly." She did not go toward the main entrance. She went toward the door. Isidore kept watching, because whatever was coming through it, she needed to know what it was before it reached the gathering. Lord Caldrant made a sharp movement. She saw it in her peripheral vision, and one of his people blocked the corridor ahead of her. "The guest areas are the other direction," said the blocking vampire pleasantly. "I have a sensitivity to enclosed spaces," she said. "I need air. That door leads outside, doesn't it? I'll escort you to the garden entrance." "That's very kind," she said, and turned back as though acquiescing, and in the same motion used the 3 seconds his attention shifted to step to the right into the shadows of the corridor alcove and wait. He passed. She continued to the door. She opened it and found herself in a secondary courtyard, stone-walled and lantern-lit, and found 4 vampires she did not recognize from any court record or gathering list. One of whom was holding a device she had read about in the archive's most restricted section, a resonance emitter calibrated to the specific frequency of Rafael Veyr's blood signature. It was a weapon designed to locate a specific vampire and collapse his nervous system from a distance of up to 300 meters, They had his blood signature. That meant they had a spy inside the court. Someone who had access to the king's biological information. The device required 60 seconds of uninterrupted calibration to arm. It was currently at 41 seconds. Yelena did not have 60 seconds to find a better solution. She had 19. She picked up a lantern from the wall bracket and threw it directly at the device. Old oil lanterns. She knew from 3 months of working in environments where they served as atmosphere, were extremely cooperative when it came to fire. The explosion of flame was immediate and disruptive. The calibration operator released the device reflexively. The device hit the stone floor and the calibration reset. In the chaos of the sudden fire in the enclosed courtyard, Yelena ran. Not away, because away from the courtyard meant back into the hall where this was clearly orchestrated to funnel Rafael, but up, toward the parapet stairs. She had mapped from the estate's layout on the drive up because she had spent 2 hours before leaving the city memorizing the floor plan from the archive's historical property records. She reached the parapet. She pressed her wrist hard and thought of him with everything she had. He came over the outer wall like a storm given form. She had never seen Rafael move at full, unconstrained speed before. Every other time she had witnessed him in motion, he had been measured, controlled, deliberate, wearing the careful pacing of someone who had learned to exist in a world that was not built for his actual nature. This was different. This was the truth of what he was. And it was extraordinary and terrifying, and somehow the most compelling thing she had ever witnessed. He cleared the parapet in a single motion, took in the burning courtyard below, and the 4 vampires with one rapid assessment, and looked at her. "Are you hurt?" "No." The device had his blood signature, Rafael. Someone in the court gave it to them. His face went to stone. Then he looked back at the courtyard, and he descended into it. And what happened next lasted approximately 90 seconds and left the 4 pale consensus operatives considerably worse off than they arrived, though alive, because he was a great many things, but he was not someone who killed unnecessarily, which was one of the things respected most about him. She learned afterward that he had deployed 3 additional security personnel to the estate perimeter the moment the blood link signaled her distress. She learned that Lord Cauldron had not been complicit. The gathering had genuinely been a territorial mediation, and the pale consensus had simply used it as cover, counting on Cauldron's property to mask their presence. She learned that the spy inside the court was Lord Casimir's personal aide, who had been feeding information to the consensus for months, and who was in custody within the hour. On the drive back to the city, in the back of the court vehicle, Rafael sat beside her rather than across from her, and for the first part of the journey neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You threw a lantern at a resonance emitter." "The calibration required 60 seconds, she said. "I had 19. You could have run. If it had armed and you had come close to the estate to reach me, it would have killed you." Another silence. "Different quality, she could feel the weight of it, Yelena," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it was dangerous. I calculated the acceptable level of risk." "That is not what I was going to say." She turned to look at him, in the moving darkness of the car, lit only by the passing city lights. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it. The careful stillness had slipped, and underneath it was something that looked very much like someone who had just understood something profound and was not entirely sure what to do with the understanding. "What were you going to say?" she asked. "That you continue to be the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time," he said. "And that I am aware this is not a professionally appropriate observation, and that I am finding it increasingly difficult to care about that." The city moved past the windows. She could feel the blood link's warmth as a pulse against her wrist, steady and present. "For what it's worth," she said carefully, "I think professional appropriateness is a framework that was designed for contexts that look very different from this one." He looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. "It is worth a great deal," he said. They arrived back at the court building. They were surrounded immediately by staff and security and the logistics of the evening's fallout, and the moment closed like water over a stone, but it did not disappear. She could feel the shape of it for the rest of the night, warm and precise. The formal investigation of the Pale Consensus took 3 weeks and involved every resource the Northern Court could deploy. Yelena was at the center of it, not as a peripheral support presence, but as a core analyst. She built the behavioral profiles, identified the communication patterns, and twice caught threads in the intelligence reporting that the court's own investigators had missed because they were working from assumptions built on centuries of vampire-centric political thinking. And she was not. The court's response to her changed during those weeks and not entirely voluntarily. The change was driven partly by visibility and partly by a series of very quiet conversations that Rafael clearly had with key members of the inner circle, conversations whose content she was not privy to, but whose effect was observable in the way Lord Morvain now met her eyes when she entered a room, and the way Lady Drusilla Corvin, the court's head of intelligence, began including her in the morning briefings without being asked. There was still resistance. A faction of old-world purists, who found the entire concept of a human liaison philosophically offensive, had begun circulating objections through the court's formal channels, citing blood law and historical precedent and the deeply felt conviction that Raphael's judgment had been compromised by proximity. The word they used in the formal documents was entangled. Yelena read those documents. She read them with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, and she thought about them with the part of her mind that was not currently occupied by the steady awareness of a specific direction in which warmth lived. And she concluded that the purists were not entirely wrong, that something had changed. She was simply not convinced it was a problem. She told Raphael about the formal objections on a Thursday morning in the archive room because she believed in telling him things directly and early and not filtering them for palatability. He read through the documents she had printed. He set them down. "This is a formal challenge to my court decision," he said. "By blood law, it requires a response before the inner circle within 30 days. What does the response involve? I appear before the circle and I either justify the decision or I rescind it." He turned the pen over in his fingers. Justifying a human liaison role is straightforward. Justifying any broader, personal development is considerably more complicated. She looked at him. "Is there something to justify?" He set the pen down very precisely. He turned to look at her with the full attention that always made her feel like the only point of focus in any room. "I am aware," he said, "that what is appropriate for me in terms of personal connection carries implications that would not apply to a human in a comparable situation. That an attachment to someone in my court's orbit could be read as a power imbalance. That I hold authority over your professional circumstances in ways that create an inherent asymmetry. I have been thinking about this for some time." "So have I," she said. "I reached a different conclusion. Tell me." "The power asymmetry you are describing exists whether or not we acknowledge whatever is between us. Pretending it doesn't, so that we can maintain a careful professional distance, doesn't eliminate it. It just makes it invisible, which is worse. And the implication that I am unable to make informed decisions about my own situation because you are the king and I am the liaison is precisely the kind of thinking that I have spent 8 months working very hard to counteract in this building." He was quiet for a long moment. "You have thought about this more than I anticipated," he said. "I think about most things more than people anticipate." Something in his face shifted, all the careful distance of the past weeks. All the measured restraint that he wore with the same disciplined grace as his regal bearing, and underneath it the truth that she had been watching accumulate for months. He stood up from his chair and crossed the distance between them, and he took her hands in his, both of them cool and careful, and he looked at her for a moment in which she was acutely aware of how old he was and how present he was, simultaneously, a centuries-long life contained in this specific, immediate attention. "Yelena," he said, "I would like to be honest with you. You have been honest with me," she said. It's something I value. I have been honest about facts, about court politics and blood law and operational matters." His thumbs moved slightly against the backs of her hands. "I have been considerably less honest about the experience of knowing you. About what it has been to have someone in this court who sees clearly and acts without hesitation and argues with me as an equal and throws lanterns at weapons that could kill me and never once makes me feel like the authority I carry is the interesting thing about me." She felt the warmth in her chest that she had been cataloguing and declining to name for weeks, and she stopped declining. "What does blood law say about this?" she asked, not because she needed the answer to decide, but because she knew it mattered to him, and she wanted to understand the full landscape. Blood law recognizes deep personal bonds between vampires and humans as valid and protected, provided the human enters willingly and with full knowledge, he said. It does not prohibit them. The purists cite older texts, but those interpretations were rejected in the court reformation I presided over 15 years ago. I specifically had them rejected. In retrospect, perhaps I was planning ahead. She looked at him. That was a joke, a small one. The corner of his mouth moved. My sense of humor tends to emerge at significant moments. I cannot explain it. She laughed, that full, unguarded laugh, and he watched it with an expression that was no longer something she needed to catalogue and defer. She knew what it was. She had known for a while. Then I would like to be honest too, she said. I came here because I needed a job that paid well enough, and because the archive door was broken and the work was interesting. I stayed because the work became genuinely important. And something else happened that I was not expecting, and that I have been describing to myself in professional terms for approximately 2 months, which was intellectually dishonest of me. What would the accurate description be? He asked. That I am in this room with you every morning because it is the best part of my day, she said. That I know the specific quality of your attention, and I find it more steadying than most things I have ever encountered. That when the resonance device was arming in that courtyard, the calculation I made was not purely tactical. She met his eyes. Is that honest enough? Yes, he said quietly. More than enough. He lifted one of her hands and pressed his lips against her knuckles. An old-world gesture that felt completely natural coming from him. And she thought about the hundreds of years of restraint and governance and isolation it probably represented, and she held very still and let the moment be exactly what it was. I should address the formal challenge before the inner circle, he said against her hand. I should do it properly and early and make the court's position on both the liaison role and any associated matters completely clear. All right, she said. I would like you to be there. She considered that. You want me in the room when you defend this to the inner circle. I want you there because you are part of this and you should not be absent from a proceeding that concerns you. Also, because you will almost certainly identify at least 2 logical errors in any argument they present, and I find your instinct for logical errors to be one of the most attractive things about you, which tells you something about my particular preferences. She looked at him for a moment. Rafael, she said, that is possibly the most unusual compliment I have ever received. I mean it entirely. I know you do, she said. That's why it works. The formal session before the inner circle took place on a Monday evening, in the court's great hall, vaulted stone and old tapestries, and the specific gravity of centuries of institutional memory hanging in the air like incense. Yelena sat in the chair that had been placed for her at the edge of the council ring, because Rafael had made it explicitly clear that she was present as an invited participant and not as a subject of the proceedings, and there was a quality in his voice when he said it that suggested anyone who challenged the distinction would find the challenge costly. There were 11 inner circle members. 8 approached the discussion with genuine good faith, questions about operational security, about the blood law implications, about protocol for future diplomatic engagements. Yelena answered 3 of those questions directly when the members asked her, because Rafael had introduced her as someone whose answers were worth hearing, and she answered them precisely and without defensiveness. The 3 who were opposed were led by Lord Aldrich Morvain, who had clearly spent the intervening weeks building the most sophisticated possible case. He cited 12 specific historical precedents. He argued that the liaison role created structural vulnerabilities that the Pale Consensus had already demonstrated the ability to exploit. He argued, with the particular delicacy of someone who had found, through pressure points, that the king's obvious personal interest compromised his ability to objectively evaluate those vulnerabilities. Yelena listened to the full argument. Then she said, "May I respond to the Lord's concern about structural vulnerability?" Morvain looked at her with the expression of someone who has planned for several eventualities and not this specific one. The two successful pale consensus operations against the Northern Court this year, she said. Targeted internal intelligence failures. First, the Casimir network, which existed long before my appointment, and second, the aide who provided the blood signature, who was also a pre-existing embedded spy. Neither operation was enabled by the liaison role. Both were resolved faster because of it. If the Lord's concern is structural vulnerability, the data suggests the liaison function reduces it. If the concern is actually about precedent and old world codes, I would ask the Lord to say so directly, because I prefer honest disagreement to arguments made in its clothing. A very full silence. Several of the 8 good faith members made expressions that Yelena catalogued as carefully suppressed approval, Morvain said, with the tight composure of someone reassembling themselves. The king's personal involvement with the liaison creates a protection detail obligation that could be weaponized. I've been weaponized already, Yelena said pleasantly. I set a curtain on fire and threw a lantern at a resonance emitter. I think I am demonstrating reasonable self-sufficiency. Someone on the inner circle, she thought it was Lady Corvin, made a sound that was almost definitely a suppressed laugh. Rafael said, very calmly, I will make the court's position clear. The liaison role is permanent and expands with the court's operational needs. Any personal development in my life is governed by blood law, which supports it, and by my own judgment, which also supports it. Formal challenges to either will be heard through the appropriate channels and addressed as such. The court's function is the welfare of those within its protection, the preservation of the peace, and the enforcement of the blood laws. Everything I have done in the past months serves those ends. I trust the circle to see it clearly. He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. The formal vote was 7-3 in favor of affirming the liaison role and dismissing the challenge. Morvain abstained from the personal matter question entirely, which Yelena read as the closest thing to concession he was built to offer. After the session in the corridor outside the Great Hall, she said to Rafael, 7-3 was better than I expected. I expected 8-2, he said. Lord Harvin surprised me. I will need to review his recent correspondence. It was the personal matter question, she said. He's old world enough to have genuine philosophical objections to cross-community relationships, but not so opposed that he voted against the operational conclusion. He separated them. You were watching him? I was watching everyone. She paused. He's probably a lost cause on the personal matter, but he is not hostile. If you want him as a genuine ally on the operational side, I would suggest letting him see the consensus intelligence files I finished compiling last week. His family lost members to the fracture. He will understand what protecting the court means. Rafael stopped walking and turned to look at her in the corridor's dim light. You have already thought of how to bring him around, he said. I think about most things. You told me that before. He reached out and very gently moved a strand of hair from her face, a small gesture, unhurried, that said several things without words. I find I think about considerably fewer things when you are near me, which is unusual. I am not accustomed to my attention narrowing. Is that a problem? She asked. It is the most wonderful problem I have ever had, he said. She leaned up and kissed him. It was her initiative, entirely, because she had made her peace with what she felt, and she saw no reason to wait for a more ceremonially appropriate moment, when this corridor, this dim light, and this particular expression on his face were perfectly sufficient. He was still for one startled second, and then he kissed her back with the attentiveness he brought to everything, and the warmth of the blood link, and the warmth of something considerably more personal to her mind, until she could not tell them apart, which seemed right. When they separated, he looked at her with an expression she had no need to catalogue anymore. I have been a king for 40 years, he said, and I have not once done anything that was not measured and deliberate and considered from every angle before action. I know, she said. I want to be very deliberate about this, he said. About you, about all of it. I want to do this properly and with full acknowledgement of everything it means, including the parts that are complicated and the parts that require patience and the parts where the world we are navigating has rules that sometimes make things harder than they should be. I know that too, she said. I read the blood law archives very thoroughly. I know what a formal bond means and what it does and does not require. I know the timeline that court protocol would expect. I know the political implications. She looked at him steadily. I am not asking for any of that tonight. I am just asking for what this is. And what is this? He asked. Something real, she said. That is sufficient for now. Yes, he said, it is. Over the following months, the work continued. The pale consensus proved a more distributed network than the initial arrests had suggested, and dismantling it required patience and precision, and a great many late nights in the archive room and the intelligence briefing chambers. Yelena finished her graduate thesis during those months. She had negotiated with her university supervisor a remote completion arrangement, submitting her research on group behavioral dynamics under conditions of coercive social pressure, which had been enriched considerably by her actual professional experience into ways she was careful to anonymize. She received her degree in the spring. Rafael had a framed copy of her certification hung in the archive room before she noticed what he had done, which was one of the most specifically touching things anyone had ever done for her. Her mother's health stabilized. The care facility the court protection extended to had connected her with a specialist, and while the illness was not cured, it was managed, and Yelena's mother was well enough for a visit in which Yelena sat beside her bed and described her work in careful, truthful terms that conveyed the reality without the specific classified details. Her mother, who had spent a lifetime believing in reading everything and fearing nothing, said, "You sound happy," not as a question. "I am," Yelena said. "Is there a person involved?" her mother asked. "There is," Yelena said. "Good," said her mother. "Bring them sometime." Yelena thought about that conversation for several days before she mentioned it to Rafael. They were in the archive room, which had become as comfortable to her as any room she had ever inhabited. The fire, the books, the desk, the chair where he sat across from her and turned a pen over in his fingers when he was thinking. "My mother would like to meet you," she said. He looked up from the intelligence file he was reading. "Your mother knows about... She knows I am happy and that there is a person involved. She does not know the specific nature of your court position or your longer lifespan. I would like to tell her. She handles information well. She always has." He set the file down. His expression was something she could read easily now, and what she read was a particular kind of moved attention that he carried very quietly. "You want to bring your mother into this," he said. "She's important to me," Yelena said. "And I don't believe in maintaining permanent separations between the important things in my life. It gets exhausting and it isn't honest." He was quiet for a moment. "I have not met someone's family," he said, "in a very long time. I would like to do it properly. I would like to bring her something appropriate, and I would like your guidance on what she values, and I would like to not make this awkward through overcalculation." "She likes books," Yelena said. "Old ones, history, and natural science. She finds confident people reassuring rather than intimidating, provided they are also kind. And she will almost certainly ask you very direct questions about your intentions." "I will answer them honestly," he said. "She will appreciate that," Yelena smiled. "She might also ask how old you are." "I will answer that honestly too," he said. "And whatever her reaction is, I will give her the time she needs to process it, because that is a significant piece of information." "She will process it faster than you expect," Yelena said. "She is where I get it from." He looked at her across the desk with everything she had come to understand was in him. The centuries of responsibility and isolation and the specific loneliness of carrying a role too large for ordinary connection. And, underneath it, all the warmth that had been there from the moment he told her to call him Rafael in that first meeting. The warmth that had grown with every morning in this room and every late conversation and every moment in which she had simply been herself and he had met her there. "Yelena," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something. Not in a formal court context, not with protocol or blood law procedure or official timing. Just here, in this room that has become the place I think of when I think of the best parts of my current existence." She put her pen down. She waited. "The blood link fades in 30 days unless renewed," he said. "I have renewed it 3 times. I renew it because the idea of not knowing where you are and whether you are safe is something I find intolerable, and I am aware that the practical functions and has become entangled with something that is not strictly operational." He looked at her steadily. "I would like to ask if you would consider a formal bond. Not because blood law requires it, or court protocol suggests it, because I choose it. Because I want a permanent thread between your life and mine that is not something I have to renew, but something that simply is. Because you are the most important person in my world, and I want the world to know it through the most enduring means available to me. Her breath steadied. The warmth in her chest was enormous and very calm. A formal bond is permanent, she said. Yes, it would mark me, in the court's records and in old-world social terms, as someone under the specific protection and personal claim of the King of the Northern Court. Yes, and it would mark me, in precisely the same terms, as someone who has given that claim and all the responsibility it carries. It goes both ways. It always has in the blood law's oldest texts, though the purists prefer to ignore that part. I know, she said. I read those texts. You read everything. It's one of my best qualities. It is one of many, he said, and there was nothing measured or deliberate about the way he said it. It came from somewhere older than his governance and more honest than his careful authority. She stood up and came around the desk and stood in front of him, and she took his face in her hands, which was one of the things she had discovered in the months of this careful, real, increasingly uncontainable thing between them, that he responded to being held with the same particular stillness of something that has been tightly managed for a very long time, finally being permitted to be still for a different reason. Yes, she said, I will. His hands came up to cover hers. I will make it properly ceremonial, he said, with full court attendance and the old-world acknowledgement and every formal requirement observed, so that no one in this building or any other court can question the legitimacy or the intent. I know you will, she said. But right now, in this room, can we just be this, before it becomes a court event, just for a few minutes? He turned his face into her palm. Yes, he said, just this. The formal bonding ceremony took place 6 weeks later in the court's great hall, with the inner circle present and the old-world texts read in their original language, and the blood law acknowledgements spoken by Rafael in a voice that carried every year of his centuries and every gram of the weight he was taking on willingly. Deliberately, with his eyes on Yelena's face through the entire proceeding, Lady Corvin, who had become something approaching a genuine ally over the months of pale consensus work, served as the court's formal witness. Lord Harven, who had separated his philosophical reservations from his operational respect for Yelena, and had come around with exactly the speed she had predicted once he reviewed the intelligence files, stood in the third row and maintained an expression of dignified composure with the particular effort of someone who was privately moved. Lord Morvain was not in attendance. He had submitted a formal request to relocate to the Western Court, which Rafael had granted with courteous expediency and genuine relief. Yelena wore the color of deep garnet, because Isolde had mentioned in passing that it was a significant color in old-world court ceremonial, and Yelena liked knowing what things meant. She stood in the great hall's center and felt the stone floor under her feet and the fire's warmth and the weight of being exactly where she was, with full consciousness of every layer of what it meant, and she was not afraid. Rafael came to her at the altar stone, wearing the formal black and silver of the Northern Court, his white hair loose, his expression open in a way the court had probably never witnessed in 40 years of his governance, vulnerable without being weak, certain without being closed, the specific combination of strength and tenderness that she had watched construct itself through every morning in the archive room and every dangerous evening, and every conversation in which he met her as someone worth meeting. The old-world words were spoken. The blood law bond was made. The court acknowledged it. He kissed her with the same composed gravity he brought to everything, and then against her hair he said something very quietly that was not for the court or the ceremony or the blood law records, something that was purely and completely for her. You set my curtain on fire, he said. She laughed. In the great hall of the Northern Vampire Court, with the inner circle watching and the old-world gravity of the ceremony still ringing in the stone, she laughed freely and completely. You were about to die, she said. I was not going to die, he said, and the curve of his mouth against her hair was everything she had catalogued and named and chosen. 2 seconds, she said. 2 very long seconds, he conceded. I was aware of the situation. You were not? I was somewhat aware. Rafael, I was grateful, he said. I was then and I am now, and I will be for considerably longer than you can probably calculate, and that is the truest thing I know how to say. She held him in the great hall of his court, this ancient, careful, extraordinary person who had spent centuries governing and protecting and carrying the weight of centuries alone. And she felt the bond as something warm and permanent, and as deeply integrated as her own heartbeat. The Pale Consensus was formally dismantled 8 months later, its network fully mapped and neutralized through a combination of court intelligence operations and Yelena's behavioral profiles, which had allowed the court's field teams to predict 17 of the Consensus's remaining operational moves before they occurred. The final operation brought down the Consensus inner council. 7 vampires of old world lineage, who had believed with genuine and terrible conviction that coexistence was corruption, and who had never considered that a human woman reading in a broken lock archive room might be the thing that undid them. The Northern Court held a formal acknowledgement ceremony. Yelena stood at Rafael's side in her capacity as court liaison and bondholder, and by this point, a genuine institutional presence whose professional standing had been earned through months of demonstrated expertise. Lady Corvin gave a speech. Lord Harven proposed formally expanding the liaison role into a permanent office with staffing and operational independence, which passed without significant opposition. After the ceremony, in the quiet of the court building's small garden, an interior space with stone walls and a carefully maintained oak tree that was significantly older than any garden. Oak had a right to be. Yelena sat beside Rafael on a bench and leaned against his shoulder and thought about the shape of her life as it currently existed. She had a permanent position in a court that had come to accept her. She had her graduate degree framed on the archive room wall. She had her mother, whose health was stable and who had met Rafael with the direct and unimpressed confidence of someone who had already concluded from her daughter's voice that this was the right person, and who had asked him exactly 2 questions: what his intentions were and whether he knew how to make a good cup of tea, and been satisfied with both answers. The first because he answered it with complete honesty, and the second because he admitted he did not but was prepared to learn. She had the warm, permanent thread of the bond which felt nothing like constraint. It felt like company. "What are you thinking about?" Rafael asked. He was doing the thing he did when he was relaxed, not entirely still, one hand moving slightly at his side, the old human habit of the pen translated into simple, quiet motion. "The first night," she said, "in the lounge, when I watched Casimir take the blade out and I did the math and I thought, I have about 40 minutes to figure out what to do with this. What did you decide in those 40 minutes? "I hadn't decided anything specific," she said. "I just knew I was going to do whatever was necessary. The specific what was going to depend on the specific moment." He was quiet for a moment. "And you were not frightened?" "I was frightened," she said. Fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. Fear just tells you that the situation is serious. What you do with it is the question. He turned to look at her in the garden's quiet. The oak tree moved slightly overhead. The light in the court's interior space was artificial, but designed to approximate a certain quality of natural warmth, and in it, he looked exactly like what he was. Ancient and present, formal and genuine, dangerous and completely safe. All of these things simultaneously and without contradiction. "I would like," he said, "to spend a very long time understanding how your mind works. I'll be here," she said, "for as long as you'll have me." "That," he said, "will be considerably longer than a human lifespan typically covers." She had thought about this. She had read everything the archive had on the subject. The blood law provisions, the historical cases, the biological and metaphysical literature, all of it, and she had reached conclusions that she had sat with long enough to be certain of them. "Then we should discuss the options," she said. "Not urgently, not immediately, but eventually and properly." "I know the options," he said, "and I know what I would ask if you were willing, and I know that I will not ask it until you are completely and fully certain, without any pressure from the bond or the court or the nature of this relationship." "I know," she said. "That's why I trust you." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. The oak tree was still overhead. "Yelena," he said. "Yes, I am very glad you were working that night." "So am I," she said, "and that the archive door was broken." "I reported it 3 times," she said. I had the lock repaired afterward, he said. She looked up at him. You fixed it? Properly, he said. With a very good lock. She considered this, and then gave me archive access anyway. Of course, he said. You earned it. She laughed again, and he held her under the ancient oak tree in the heart of his court, and the bond between them was warm and permanent and entirely mutual, and the world that contained them, stone and old blood law and centuries of complicated history, and all the dangerous, beautiful difficulty of two different kinds of people choosing each other across every possible obstacle, continued on around them with all its politics and its threats and its ancient pride. But in this moment, in the garden, none of that was the loudest thing. The loudest thing was this, the rightness of it, the specific warmth of something that had been chosen clearly and deliberately, and with full knowledge of its cost and its weight, and chosen anyway. She had come to work at the Obsidian Lounge because she needed the income. She had watched the court because she watched everything. She had acted on a Tuesday night because the math required it, and because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother has always said that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing were supposed to happen in the same breath. She had not expected to end up here. She had not expected any of this. But she had stopped being surprised by what she was capable of somewhere around the time she threw the lantern, and she had stopped being surprised by what he felt somewhere around the time he told her. She was the most remarkable person he had met in a very long time in the back of a moving car in the rainlit city. The court had thought she was powerless. The court had looked through her for 8 months, the way people look through furniture, and she had used that invisibility to learn everything worth knowing, and to be ready when the moment came. The court had been wrong about her. Rafael had never been wrong about her, not from the first day, and that was the thread that ran through everything, being seen clearly and valued honestly, and protected without being diminished, and offering the same in return. That was the shape of it. That was what they had built, and it was very, very good. Outside the court building, the city continued its ordinary life. People moving through lighted streets, living inside the mundane day-to-day of a world that mostly did not know what was woven into its foundations, what ancient things kept certain agreements and enforced certain laws, and kept certain old bargains that the city's safety depended on without the city ever knowing. That was the nature of it. The protection was invisible precisely because it worked. Yelena Carmichael knew. She had always believed in knowing things, and from the inside, she could say with complete authority that the world beneath the world was extraordinary and complicated and genuinely dangerous, and also, in the specific instance that mattered most to her, very much worth the knowing. She closed her eyes in the garden. She felt the warmth of the bond and the arm around her shoulder and the old living presence of the oak overhead, and she let herself be exactly where she was, complete, certain, home. Rafael pressed his lips against her hair. Stay, he said, not as a king, not as a court, just as himself, asking the simplest possible question. Yes, she said, just as herself, meaning every syllable.